Hi, and thanks for tuning into the Kate Valentine UFO show. Our guest today is Mr. Robert Schroeder. He has returned to his hometown of Teaneck to be with us in the studio today. Robert's here to discuss his book, Solving the UFO Enigma. For those of you who want to get into the real meat of what makes these little unexplained objects tick, this is the book to have. Again, we'll rocket through space, travel through time. Well, Bob's going to tell us how to do that. Welcome to the show, Bob. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this.
Oh, no problem, really. We were talking before the show, and I'll tell you, this fella is just full of good stuff. But, Bob, as I told you, the first question would be to investigate UFOs, you actually have to have some feeling that they are out there. And you started on that with your own sighting when you were just a boy.
Right here in Teaneck, New Jersey, back in 1957, which any people who have followed the UFO phenomenon over the years are familiar with, that particular year was a tremendous wave of UFOs seen all around the country. And I happened to get lucky, and I saw one of these things. I admit I was only 12 years old. However, I had very good eyesight. I still don't wear glasses today, and I'm lucky. And but anyway, I saw a cylinder looking kind of like a cigarette. We lived right here in Teaneck, and it was heading toward New York City, but it was followed by a round object that was no wider than the width of the cylinder. And the two of them were obviously traveling in tandem, one after the other, and they're heading toward New York City. Teaneck is maybe 3-4 miles west of New York. And they looked like they were pretty high in the sky, maybe 5,000 feet, about the height of a jet airliner. But what struck me was the thing had no wings. And I had good eyesight, and I could clearly see that it was blunt on the front and the back. And so I was absolutely amazed. And so I ran inside, told my brothers and sisters. I tried to get them to come out to see it. I only got a couple of my brothers, and they came out and just caught it as it headed over the trees toward New York. But years later, and I'll end this story here in a second, I read that many people reported these large cylinders, and these large cylinders appear to be carriers for the more typical flying saucer, and that does appear to be what I had seen. And at first I thought the thing behind it was a sphere, but now I realize it was probably a flying saucer, a flat disc-shaped type object seen from below. And anyway, that's what got me going. But I should mention one more thing. I do come from a family of scientists and engineers, and so my interest is my immediate interest when I not only when I saw this, but years later, as I read more stories about these things, I wanted to know how they worked, and I've spent years, literally decades, trying to figure this out, and only in the last 20 years have their developments in physics are, I believe, pointing toward a likely explanation of UFO physics, and we can get into that.
Yeah, I was going to say, that was part of your story, is that you do come from a family of science, and different people approach this, just like the 4 blind men with the elephant. They approach them from different angles. I like your angle most, I think, because at least it gives us a foothold. It's a start. I mean, it may not explain everything, but at least it gives us some explanation. It may not explain all sightings, but it explains a lot, which you also, Bob, very carefully selects various sightings, very credible sightings, very credible witnesses, sightings, radar, and everything, so that, yeah, there are objects that are unidentified that fly. And so then as an engineer, you started to back engineer. Okay, like, all right, these things are flying, they're up there, nobody knows what they are. So let me try it by some of the characteristics that they exhibit. Let me see if I can back figure from those characteristics what's going on. And then as Bob told me, his purpose in being here today is because he is a man on a mission. So go ahead with your mission then.
Okay. My mission is I'm actually trying to generate interest. I'm hoping among people who who are interested in the UFO phenomenon, to, begin to take the research much more seriously, because I believe we may very well be on the threshold of understanding the technology of these craft. And let me just give some background as to why I think that's the case. I'm just going to go through this quick because the show is only an hour. But I think that back when I first began examining these UFO reports, I thought, like many other people, that they were using anti-gravity, and that seemed like a natural explanation. But now I no longer believe that, and I believe they don't even need to use anti-gravity. And I'll explain how I think they're working. One of the strange things that I noticed in many, many reports is that when UFOs were very close to the ground, they often lifted objects or water up underneath them. And a classic case that typified this type of behavior was up in Wanacue Reservoir in 1966. And in that case, Sergeant Ben Thompson observed a UFO over the Wanacue Reservoir, and he noticed that it was in the dark, but he noticed that the water was being lifted up underneath the UFO and toward the bottom of the UFO. And when I saw that report, I was absolutely baffled, because I assumed that they were using anti-gravity back in those days. And clearly this was not anti-gravity. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. It was attractive gravity. And many, many reports since that time have convinced me that these craft have a strong local attractive gravity field around them. And I emphasize local because it's not a long-range field. But anyway, so I saw other indications that there were strong attractive gravity fields around UFOs. One was in Norwood, Ohio, back in 1949. A Reverend Miller was running a craft fair or something at his church, and to attract people in the community, the surrounding communities, to the fair, he rented a searchlight from the Army, and he had a sergeant from the Army, come and operate it. And when they were shining it up into the clouds, people noticed that there was this gigantic object, a typical UFO, that was or in that area. And what surprised a lot of people was the light beam from the searchlight was bent toward the UFO, not away from it, but toward it. And there have been many other cases like this where light has been bent, where indications that time has slowed down, which is also around a strong gravity field, time will slow down. And there's other indications, like where people have felt lifted up, like two women in a car up in Cochrane, Wisconsin, were driving along, and a UFO came over their car, and they reported to Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was the advisor to the United States Air Force. They reported to him that they felt the sensation of weightlessness, and as if that everything was lighter than air, and they were being lifted up toward the object. So anyway, that had got me thinking. And although I was working full-time at Hewlett-Packard, I was there for like 27 years. I just retired a couple years ago, and even before I retired, over the last 15 years, I've been really studying this, and I think I have an idea of how they're doing this. And I don't know if Jackie wants to say something here.
No, not at all. Actually, no, I'm really fascinated. I think we're probably coming up on a break fairly soon, so I don't want to get into brains and all that other business right now. But just to sort of intrigue you people a little bit, I think Bob has actually figured out how these craft move from like here to Alpha Centauri in a few minutes. And he thinks it's very possible for us to achieve that as well. And so just keep tuned because we're getting there. And anyway, so you interpolated backwards from, you saw all these physical manifestations of this craft, and you figured out, what could it be? And the good point I like in your book is you say, no, they don't use anti-gravity, because after all, once you're outside a gravitational field, what good is anti-gravity to you? And that was perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's right. I said that in the book.
Yeah.
And I even forgot I said it.
That was a great point. That was an excellent point.
Yeah. And what I and I also, when I started studying physics, we are going to take a break now. You see that? Yeah, so that's good. So stay tuned if you want to get to Alpha Centauri in 10 minutes. Bob will tell you how. Kate Valentine speaking to Bob Schroeder. He is the author of Solving the UFO Enigma. We are in 1160 WVNJ, excuse me, Dave. We need to take a quick break, but would love to have you join in on this conversation. If you have questions, please post them now at AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, get a hold of a copy of this book, Solving the UFO Enigma. It will fascinate you. Be right back. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today is Robert Schroeder. He is the author of Solving the UFO Enigma, a book that should be in every ufologist library and available through Amazon. He welcomes your questions or your comments, and you can post them now on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. So, Bob, just before the break, we were talking about, and I know it's going to be difficult for you to explain it in just a few minutes, but how these craft would be able, or just what the whole theory, what the history behind brains and M space and so on is. Okay. You got 5 minutes. Go. Okay. Well, it's maybe I can. It's important, I think, to do a little bit of history of physics, yes. And but let's see. You can think of everything in everything around us, the entire universe, as consisting of matter and force particles, matter particles and force particles acting on the stage of space-time. So one way you can think of that is like, if you think of our universe as a two-dimensional thing instead of the four-dimensional, think of it as a flat piece of paper, and there's gazillions and gazillions of these little particles, force particles and matter particles, that are all interacting to create the universe that we see. And but anyway, historically, going all the way back to classical physics of Newton, the laws of motion, and his original theory of gravity, right up to James Clerk Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism in the 1800s, and then up to special and general relativity at the beginning of the 20th century, and quantum mechanics in the early 20th century as well, and actually right up to about perhaps the mid 1970s, physicists generally thought that the universe was of four dimensions only. They thought it was only a four-dimensional universe, but one of the things that's considered the holy grail of modern physics is the unification of the forces of nature. So everybody's familiar with matter particles like an electron, a proton, a neutrino. I think most people have heard of those terms. But the forces are also carried by particles, and so, for example, there are four fundamental forces in nature. There's the electromagnetic force. There's the weak nuclear force, which is responsible for radioactivity. There's the strong nuclear force, which holds the nucleus of the atom together. And then there's the force of gravity, which we all fight every day when we're getting out of bed and going to work. Sometimes not so successfully. And but anyway, all these forces are carried by particles. So the electromagnetic force is carried by a particle called the photon. The weak nuclear force is carried by three particles, the W plus, the W minus, and the Z neutral bosons. Boson is the physics term for a force carrier. The strong nuclear force is carried by gluons, and the reason it's called gluons is related to glue, because it holds together the protons of the nucleus so they don't fly apart. So physicists have a sense of humor, and they decided that let's call it glue or gluons. And then gravity is carried by a hypothetical particle called the graviton. And the reason I call it hypothetical, all the other particles in physics, the non-gravity particles, force particle carriers, they have been identified in particle accelerators. They've seen them. They have not seen the graviton. And anyway, as I mentioned earlier, the holy grail of modern physics is to unite the four forces of nature: gravity, the weak force, the strong nuclear force, and electromagnetism. And they've made tremendous progress uniting the three non-gravity forces. But so far they have not been able to bring gravity into the unification of the forces. And there's a reason why. The primary reason why they haven't been able to do it is because the force of gravity is incredibly weak compared to the non-gravity force interaction strengths. And the non-gravity, to give you a comparison, the electromagnetic force, the photon, its strength, interaction strength between, say, a proton and an electron, is 10 to the 36th power. So that's 1 followed by 36 zeros stronger than the gravity force. And this holds for the other two non-gravity forces too. The weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force have similar interaction strengths like the electromagnetic force. And so that gigantic, absolutely gigantic difference in interaction strength between the non-gravity forces and the gravity force is the reason, one of the primary reasons why it's been so difficult to understand gravity and try to bring it into a unification theory with the other three forces of nature. And so, as I mentioned before, up until the late 70s, so they've been, so let me go back here a little bit. They've been struggling trying to unite the four forces of nature. But around the late 70s, mid to late 70s, up until that point, all the way from Isaac Newton, through Maxwell, through quantum mechanics and general relativity, it had been thought that we lived in a four-dimensional universe. But starting in the mid to late 70s, they came up with new theories that indicated we may live in more than four dimensions. And I'll kind of go through this quick because we don't have too much time. But anyway, what it boils down to is it looks like we live in an 11-dimensional universe, but 6 of those dimensions are wrapped up in a tiny little area, and tiny little, like barely seen. Oops. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking to Robert Schroeder. He is author of Solving the UFO Enigma. We are on 1160 WVNJ, and that book is fascinating and available through Amazon. I'm sorry, Bob. They make us interrupt for these resets. Go right ahead. So you're talking to us about the search for the gravitons, these particles carrying gravitational force.
Exactly. They're trying to... one of the big problems in modern physics is why is the gravity force so much weaker than the other three fundamental forces of nature. And this problem in physics is referred to as the hierarchy problem. And And anyway, so it looks like we may be able to have an explanation for the hierarchy problem. And this is very exciting because it has, I believe it applies to the UFO phenomenon, and I believe it will explain how UFOs work, and we'll go right into that right here. What has happened is they think there's 11 dimensions. 6 of them are curled up. So of these 7 extra dimensions beyond 4, the 3 of space and 1 of time, there's 7 extra dimensions. 6 are believed to be curled up in a tiny little space, and so they don't impact us immediately as far as what I'm referring to in this UFO phenomenon. But the other dimension, which is a larger dimension, and so in effect there are 5 large dimensions. There's the 3 of space-time that we're familiar with, plus time, plus an additional dimension. Now, what has happened in physics is they've been moving toward a theory which people are familiar with, string theory. Many people are familiar with it. But string theory has evolved into another theory called M theory, which can stand for membranes, and it is believed that we may live on a membrane, a 4-dimensional space-time membrane, and it's floating in a larger 5-dimensional space. That's that extra 5th dimension. And it's also believed that there may be at least one other membrane parallel to the one we live on. And anyway, one of the theories that came out of M theory is a theory called warped geometry, which was developed by a Harvard physicist and another physicist from Johns Hopkins University. And their theory was designed to try to explain the hierarchy problem, why gravity is so weak. And here it is. Here's why it looks like gravity is so weak. But anyway, it looks like these 2 membranes are sitting side by side and floating in the larger 5th dimension, the larger 5th dimension. And the space between those membranes is referred to as the bulk, B-U-L-K. And the theory called warped geometry suggests that the reason gravity is so weak is because the second membrane that's parallel to the one that we live on is warped in such a way that it attracts 99.99999% of all the gravitons, the force carrier for gravity, in the larger 5-dimensional universe to the surface of that other 4-dimensional space-time membrane, which in their theory is referred to as the Planck membrane, named after Max Planck, the German physicist who was working on quantum mechanics back at the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. But anyway, the membrane that we live on is referred to as the weak membrane, and it's called weak. That only relates to the energy level of the weak nuclear force. That's not here nor there, actually. But anyway, the important thing is that the reason why gravity is so weak is because the vast majority of gravitons in the universe are near the surface of the Planck membrane, and there's only a scattering of them in the 4-dimensional membrane we live on, the weak membrane. And when I first saw that theory, I knew immediately, or I felt almost certainly, I understood how UFOs get to planet Earth. And can I continue in this, Kate?
You can, but let's take a quick break because this is a great time to do it. Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking to Robert Schroeder. He is the author of Solving the UFO Enigma, and he's about to tell us that solution. We're on 1160 WVNJ. If you have questions or comments, post them now for Robert Schroeder on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the break, you can get a copy of his book, Solving the UFO Enigma, through Amazon. We'll be right back. Hi, and welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show. We're on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today is Mr. Robert Schroeder. He is the author of Solving the UFO Enigma, a great book available through Amazon. He welcomes your questions and your comments. This is some pretty heavy stuff. I don't know if you've been listening or thinking, but it's not that easy. So if you have questions, post them now on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. If you'd like to go over this again sometime, you can catch it all on YouTube, YouTube UFO Kate. So welcome back, Bob. I think right now you were explaining, okay, we have the weak membrane, that's where we and the entire universe is on, and then you have the Planck membrane, which is over there somewhere. I don't quite get that.
Parallel
to us, and in between we have the place called the bulk, and that's where most of the gravitons hang out, attached to the Planck membrane.
Close to the surface of the Planck membrane. Yeah, and because of the I won't go into the technical details; those are in the book. But what happens is the Planck membrane is warped in such a way that the vast majority of the gravitons in the universe are attracted to the Planck membrane. But here's where it gets very, very interesting. The second I saw that theory, I realized how UFOs likely get to planet Earth. For many, many years, there have been a lot of people talking about various ways that that we could travel to other planets. Many of the people in the audience out there may have heard of the Alcubierre warp drive. Miguel Alcubierre from Mexico, a physicist, came up with an idea of basically surfing on space-time to get to other planets and systems. But it would, from the Earth point of view, it would still take forever to get there. But when I saw the warp geometry, and it would I should also mention some of these other exotic theories required huge amounts of energy in order to get to other star systems. How much energy? They would have to gobble up the entire galaxy, every planet, star, moon, everything, And of course, that would be impractical because other civilizations might object.
You think, yeah, maybe. A bummer.
And, but then, when I saw the warp geometry thing, I realized that what's happening is, I believe, these UFOs are able to penetrate the bulk. They're able to leave our space-time membrane called the weak membrane, and this, by the way, is stuff that is being investigated at the Large Hadron Collider Particle Accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland, and so this is cutting-edge physics. But anyway, I believe these UFOs have somehow figured out how to leave the weak membrane where we live, that is our universe. They penetrate into the bulk, and in the bulk, the force of gravity gets exponentially stronger the closer you get to the Planck membrane and the further away you get from the weak membrane. So it is believed that gravity reaches its maximum strength of about 10 to the 16th times stronger than what we experience here on planet Earth and in our universe. What that means is that's 1 followed by 16 zeros. That is immensely powerful. Now, one of the things that general relativity tells us is that in a strong gravity field, the distances shrink and time dilates. And what all that means is that, the distance between the normal distance that you would measure on a ruler, like a 12-inch ruler in a strong gravity field, it would only show as 1 inch, and or less, and depending on the strength of the field. And time dilation just means that time slows down. But anyway, what happened then is, as I looked at this theory, I realized that what these UFOs are doing is they're going into the bulk far enough where the distances between stars is reduced to very small distances. And to give an example, Alpha Centauri is the nearest star system to us. And those of you who are familiar with astronomy know that Alpha Centauri is about 4.3 light years from Earth, and that's trillions and trillions of miles. And if we went there with just a rocket, it would take us decades, actually centuries, to get there. And but on the other hand, I think what these UFOs are doing is they're penetrating the bulk, they're going into the bulk, and all they have to do is go into the bulk where the strength of gravity is only 1/10,000th the maximum strength of gravity in the bulk, which is 10 to the 16th power, and just that minor, relatively small distance into the bulk, the distance between Earth and Alpha Centauri is reduced from 4.3 light years to 25 miles. You could literally take your 1966 Mustang, which I once owned, and you could drive that in half an hour.
You could take a bicycle there.
You could take a bicycle there. And I think that's how the UFOs are doing it. I believe they're penetrating the bulk, and so then they're traveling to nearby stars, and part of the reason I believe this is the case is because the physics is now pointing in this direction. But another reason is I'm looking at some of the evidence from UFO reports, and one of the key pieces of evidence that we see, there was a very interesting sighting by a Captain Dubac of Air France near Paris back in 1986, I think. And Captain Dubac, he saw a gigantic UFO about 20 miles in front of him, and it was estimated to be about 800 feet in diameter. And anyway, this gigantic UFO, as he was watching it, it suddenly became partially transparent. It didn't get any smaller, but it became partially transparent. And so he was stunned, and his entire crew watched this thing, and they picked it up on the ground radar, and he was flying a 747, and they picked it up on the radar that's airborne radar too. So that's how they were able to calculate the size. Then it eventually totally disappeared.
Wow. Kate Valentine here, speaking to the amazing Robert Schroeder about his book, Solving the UFO Enigma. It's put out by Amazon. If you have questions, please post them right now. AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. So he saw this huge ship, and then it got transparent, and then, boom, disappeared. And that would also be sort of an evidence of them going into this space called the bulk.
Exactly, and I think Kate, that this was evident. This was an actual witness to these UFOs, a UFO going into the bulk and disappearing from the space-time membrane that we live on, and as the Captain Dubac watched this, the craft totally disappeared, then reappeared maybe a mile away. It suddenly seemed to rematerialize. And this is not the first time this has happened. A pilot back in the 1930s by the name of Francis Chichester, he was flying a Gypsy Moth, which was an older type of aircraft. I think it might have been a biplane. And but anyway, he was flying down in, I think, near New Zealand, and over the Tasmanian Sea. That's where he was. And he spotted a UFO, which at that time they didn't use that term UFO. They just didn't know what it was. But today we would recognize it as a UFO, as a typical disc-shaped UFO. And what happened stunned him. He was watching this thing in a perfectly clear sky when suddenly it started to almost like it began to disappear. He could see through parts of it, and then what happened is it totally disappeared. And what he noticed was the location where the UFO had been, suddenly a cloud formed right there, and for and many people who are familiar with meteorological phenomenon know that when there's a sudden vacuum, a cloud will form. A good example of that is probably something called vapor lock. Anybody who's seen a jet fighter flying at low altitude where the atmosphere is humid, a lot of moisture in it, because of the lower pressure on the back of the wing there, on the top of the wing, I'm sorry. That's how planes fly. They create a partial vacuum on the top of the wing. You'll see a vapor trail behind the jet at low altitudes. Many people at air shows have seen that. what happened here was clearly the same thing. Francis Chichester, when the UFO left our membrane and went into the bulk, it left a vacuum there, and so the water particles in the atmosphere there condensed to form a cloud. And so these kind of stories have convinced me that these things are leaving our four-dimensional space-time membrane, and they're going into this bulk.
Wow. I tell you, Bob, I think you've got at least 3 people convinced. Joe Schmo wrote in. He said, is there any experimental evidence to support the ability of an object or intelligence to transfer into the bulk, or has this theory been supported purely by mathematics? So I guess he wants to know if there's any. Well, yeah, you just said there are 2 pieces of evidence. It's not just mathematical anymore.
Kate, there now, and Joe, that was a very good question. In fact, right now at the Large Hadron Collider, which is a particle accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland, they are actually smashing subatomic particles together. And over the next few years, they hope to find indications that M-theory, membrane theory, is correct. And they're hoping also to find evidence of warp geometry, the theory that I talk about in the book, which is actually an extension of M-theory. And so they will, what will happen when they do these experiments is they will find, they'll have evidence of extra dimensions when they find missing energy. So, for example, when the particles collide together, they will look at all the particles that come out of the collision, and then there'll be still some energy missing, and that will be an indication that we are beginning to penetrate the bulk. I mean, in a relatively primitive fashion, but we're doing it.
Whoa. Yeah. All right. Well, Jason wanted to know that too. Thank you, Jason, for liking the show. But he also said, why can't or don't we travel like that? Well, I guess maybe someday we will, huh?
Jason, not yet, but I believe we will. I believe, see, this, in fact, part of my purpose in talking about my book and getting out and talking in public about this is because I'm hoping to generate interest among perhaps professors or graduate students or students who are in engineering and spectrographic analysis and things like that, to help the UFO community, those of us who are interested in it from a scientific point of view, gather spectrographic information. And here's why. It's so important. This is very, very critical. It turns out that well, actually, Kate, I have to do a little more explanation to explain why spectral evidence is important.
Well, I'll tell you, you seem to have a very good sense as to when a break is coming up, though. I have to congratulate you. Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking to Robert Schroeder. He is the author of Solving the UFO Enigma. We're on 1160 WVNJ. If you have questions or comments, you can post them on AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. You can also get a repeat of this on the YouTube, available YouTube at UFO Kate. I'll be right back after a short break. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today is Robert Schroeder. He is the author of Solving the UFO Enigma, a fascinating book available through Amazon. We've been discussing a concept that's very new to me, the bulk. Mr. Schroeder certainly welcomes your questions. You can post them now on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. You can also post them on our comment page after the show, or catch the whole thing again on YouTube under UFO Kate. Bob, during the break we had a really fascinating question from Dale Lewis. If you are using this mode or this theory of travel, is there any physical effect on a human and or alien going through it? That would be fascinating.
Dale, that's also a fantastic question. And no, I don't think so, because I believe they are able inside in the interior of the UFO, they're actually able to control the gravity field there. So they probably make it 1G, that is the same as or similar to what it is on the planet Earth on the surface. And so they make it nice and comfortable for themselves. But that's a very good question, too, from another point of view, because it leads into the next thing I was going to talk about. I'm trying to get, one of the things I'm definitely trying to do is get spectral data from actual UFO sightings. I don't happen to be an expert in spectrography, but I'm hoping to generate interest among scientists who are familiar with that field, or physicists, or graduate students, or students in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area. And now I'll explain why I'm interested in that. And that goes into the physics of the UFOs. I'll have to go through this quick because we don't have too much time. But it is believed that there are a type of particles called Kaluza-Klein particles. And this is in the book. I talk about it in the book. But these Kaluza-Klein particles are believed to be are evidence of they're particles that have extra momentum in the extra dimensions. So what that means is that these particles will behave differently than the kind of particles we're used to. But of particular interest is a particle called the KK, or Kaluza-Klein graviton. I'll call it KK graviton for short. And the ordinary graviton on planet Earth is massless. That is, it has no mass whatsoever. It travels at the speed of light. However, a new type of particle, these Kaluza-Klein particles, you can have Kaluza-Klein electrons and Kaluza-Klein quarks, but as matter particles. But you can also have Kaluza-Klein gravitons, and these gravitons have much greater interaction strength than ordinary gravitons. So, in fact, how much stronger? 10 to the 16 power stronger than an ordinary Earth graviton. This is very, very important because they expect at the Large Hadron Particle Accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland, they expect to be able to create these Kaluza-Klein gravitons. And these Kaluza-Klein gravitons, in turn, induce the formation of something called micro black holes. And these micro black holes are extraordinarily interesting because when I read about this, I wondered if maybe this is what the UFOs are using, and I think they are.
Wow.
I think what they're doing. See, now I went into something called archive.org, which is where physicists put papers, pre-published papers that will eventually get into regular physics journals. And but they put them out there. They put them out for people to view and comment on. So I happened to read so I was very interested in what these micro black holes, what they swallow. Okay, what they take in. Well, it turns out they swallow everything, including photons. You know, that's why they're called black holes, because a photon can't escape. But a graviton goes at the speed of light too. And I wondered, can it swallow a graviton? Sure enough, a number of these papers indicated, yes, sir, they can. Gravitons are swallowed by these micro black holes too. I still had a problem though, because I knew that micro black holes decay very quickly. So I had to make sure that the decay particles coming out of a micro black hole, if UFOs are using micro black holes, I had to make absolutely sure that there were no 4D gravitons, four-dimensional gravitons, in the decay, because if there were, then gravitons would still be exchanged between the UFO and Earth. However, as I studied these papers, I discovered that they all predict that the Large Hadron Collider will not see four-dimensional black holes from these decaying four-dimensional gravitons from these decaying micro black holes. And so that's important because it means, and it also turns out that most of the energy, gravitational energy that's absorbed by the micro black hole is actually emitted into the fifth dimension, into the bulk, not back onto the four-dimensional space-time weak membrane that we live on. This is critical. So the only thing we will see in the decay from the micro black holes that I think these UFOs are creating is something called Hawking radiation, which as they decay, at the very end of the decay, there's a burst of gamma rays. Gamma rays are outside the visible spectrum, and So that's why incidentally, that's why UFOs are circular in shape. The reason is they are particle accelerators. And so what they do all around the rim, they're just colliding particles together to create these micro black holes. The micro black holes, in turn, are swallowing gravitons, both from the UFO and from the Earth, because both emit gravitons. And so once and that also explains why why UFOs appear to have an attractive gravity field around them, albeit of short range, because these micro black holes the Kaluza-Klein gravitons are much stronger than ordinary gravitons. That explains why at Wanacue Reservoir the water was lifted up under the UFO. But here's the critical thing that I'm looking for. I'm really hoping I can get some interest generated from physics students, from physics professors, to help those of us who are studying the UFO phenomenon to try to get spectrographic data from UFOs. And I mean both the visible and the invisible spectrum, because one of the key types of emission that we should see will be gamma rays from decaying micro black holes. And we already have evidence of that. Back in the 1950s to the 1970s, Dr. Paul Hill, who was a NASA scientist, when studying them was more acceptable at that time, he was using relatively primitive equipment, but he detected gamma rays in the vicinity of UFOs. So that is a very, very important clue. It indicates that they almost certainly are using Kaluza-Klein gravitons, micro black holes, and what we should see is Hawking radiation.
Well, that's great, because that answered one of the questions came in from Dave. If you've been contacted by NASA or any government agency with your theories, but obviously you also mentioned before that you can really start to study these without mentioning UFOs, flying saucers is truly a career killer for any young person going into physics. But this sort of lets them study that without actually mentioning why they're doing it. So, I mean, it's sort of aggravating that they have to do it that way, but at least you give them an excuse to do this. Yeah. And I found it, and I was just thinking of something when you were talking about the gamma radiation, and it's sort of, but I really think you've hit on something, because you're right. Almost universally, they talk about some circular thing going around and around on the flying saucer, and it had never occurred to me, but yeah, you're right, particle accelerator. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's really fascinating. That's excellent.
And Kate, if I could mention something here, I haven't contacted NASA. Part of the reason is because NASA doesn't look positively on the UFO phenomenon. So I'm afraid, at least for the time being, I will have to work with people, that are interested in this and are willing to spend the time and perhaps have the access to and expertise in the use of spectrographic equipment, including gamma ray detectors. That's critical, because that's where we should most definitely see emissions from UFOs. And I'm very excited about this. There is a guy in California by the name of Doug Trumbull, who was the special effects guy for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. He was the special effects guy. He's a real pro at this stuff with cameras and stuff like that. But he's taken an interest in the UFO phenomenon, and he is trying to gather spectrographic data, although unfortunately he doesn't have gamma ray detectors. And so I'm putting out a little plea here to the greater metropolitan area. I'm hoping that there are some professors, graduate students, physics, engineering, anything, that might contact me or at least contact MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, one of the UFO research groups, and to offer their assistance if they have expertise and access to spectrographic equipment, both in the visible and the invisible spectrum.
Oh, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour. Oh, boy, I'll tell you. But thank you so much for being here today. It was wonderful for you to drive in for the show. I've been my head's spinning between bulk and brains. And again, I encourage your listeners to get your book, Solving the UFO Enigma, in their library. It'll be a wonderful reference. And rather than just wondering what these things are, this book gives us a tool to find out much more about them. Thanks, as always, to both Bill and Dave. And thank you for listening and for all your comments. They're very appreciated. And again, you can get the book by Robert Schroeder, Solving the UFO Enigma, through Amazon. And if you wish to hear the show again, you'll hear it this Sunday at 4. You can subscribe to our still free podcast. Please subscribe. Help us keep our numbers up. Have a great weekend. See you next Friday at 1. Till then, keep your eye on the sky. Bye.